Okay, so as far as starting out when you are essentially playing Game Master, one of those things that you definitely want to keep in mind is that there's a way when you are essentially starting out, you want to go to your players list, and this is, when you first join the server, if you don't have any admin credentials, then what you want to do is you want to go to the player side here, and I know like some of you guys might know how this works, right? But you essentially from this side, you nominate yourself, so you just go into the game. Let's go ahead and switch it up to Game Master so that we can go over that basic training for Game Master. And this is something that I do on the back end. So I'll typically go to the server backend settings itself, and then I'll just go to, I can switch to game type. I can switch it from capture and hold. I can switch it to conflict, east, west, north, central Everon, and so on and so forth. And then I've also got the option to do Ireland and Everon. And there's also an option to input custom map manually, like Dead Everon or Chernobyl or Chernarus or any of those new maps as well. But those are typically done on the back end, and you cannot modify those from the front end as far as, you know, on the master itself. So we'll switch over to Game Master Everon, save, we'll restart the server. You can actually do two things. You can restart it, or you can reset the server, and you can actually reset and remove everything that's on it. And then one of the things that you also want to do is you want to make sure that the server is also saved. So if you have not saved our server, you can do so by just looking at the server or finding it on the search option, which is on your top right here. And once you're here, you can go ahead and search for Regiment Discord. And then once you type it on the top right, it should appear automatically. And you definitely want to use the filter. Actually, you don't have to use the filter because we have a specific name for this server. Anyway, once you have it ready, then you can add to favorites or remove from favorites. In this case, we have, surprisingly, this is not our server actually. It is. I don't know how we have 14 gigabytes worth of stuff, but that's quite a lot. So I don't think that's accurate. Yeah, it's actually 3.3 gigabytes, not 14 gigabytes. I was going to be like, what the hell? All right. Anyway, so moving on to 3.3 gigabytes, we'll jump into the server itself. Okay, now we're jumping into the server. So I'm just going to go over a couple of need to knows and just kind of laying everything out for everybody to understand as far as how Game Master actually works. After we would go in through the first introduction of what Game Master is, and learning objectives, we're essentially just going to be getting to know the basics, right? So the basics are you would normally jump into the server, and then you'd press start, right? You've got your admin login at the top, and you need a password for that for you to have admin login. So if you had access to admin login, you would have access to being able to kick people out, to ban people from the game. You can do all of that within the game. So you're going to have multiple interfaces. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just go straight to the Game Master option here. So if you go to your players list, if you're by yourself, you can nominate yourself here in this scenario, right? You can vote to become a Game Master. You go ahead and click on that. And then now you voted yourself to be Game Master. And since I'm the only individual in this server, then I essentially nominated myself, so I become the Game Master so far. So then there's a couple of things that you can do, right? So at the bottom, you'll see, for Xbox at least, you'll have the press start and hold Y, right? So you hold start and you press Y, and it will trigger you into the Game Master role itself, right? You can also add the chat, so you can chat as well, and your pause menu. Now you can press start, and you can also go to the Game Master setting itself, and then you'll just jump into Game Master if you do it off of the start. The other option, I typically do myself, I do shortcuts, right? So just kind of like how you have shortcuts on PC, where you can actually kind of move back and forth between certain actions or certain things that you can like going from menu or teleporting and just shortcuts, right? And that's the same thing that you can do on Xbox as well. All right, so anyway, so you have your main interface when you're really jumping into here, right? So after you've already figured out, how you can nominate yourself, you can also have, if you're playing with a couple of other people, you can ask them to nominate you. But basically, those shortcuts are going to be very important. And I'm just going to be covering most of the stuff that you can do on Xbox. There's a lot more that you can actually do on PlayStation, on PC actually, as far as commands and so on and so forth, but we'll just kind of go over some of the basics, right? So you have your interface, your general interface, and in this case, you'll have at the top, you can end the session. You can, basically end the session overall, which is going to restart it. It's almost the equivalent of restarting, which is a neutral and screening, and a neutral end screen inform players that this session has ended. The second option, which is restarting the server, is just inform that the player will be restarted, and it's just gonna let the players know that overall this is almost the same thing as an end session. Then you have a faction victory and a faction tie, and of course I think those are pretty self-explanatory. But you can do that off of your HUD, and this is actually your HUD on the top side. And the other ones you can look through your map. You can also use shortcuts, right? Just like you can on PC, right? On the Xbox, if you're on legacy controls, speaking for, in terms of legacy controls, the same way you would pull out your map in Conflict or in any other game mode is the same way you're going to pull out your map in Game Master, right? And, you basically have the same entire, map overall, but then you also have this, which is basically where your camera is pointing or where you're at, as the GM. And, that's where your, view is and how much you actually cover. So the higher you go, the bigger it gets in a sense overall. This is what you're able to sort of see and what you can grasp as far as, what's on your screen. So that's what that does. And so you can trigger that, and it gives you the D-pad on the right, obviously. So local brighter night is applied when typically if it's at night, you can apply it and it just brightens up the skies to where you can see at night. And I'll just kind of give you an example here before we go into anything that's complicated, really. Let's go ahead and go through the time of day. And even if you're, in the situation where it's supposed to be pitch black, right? And it's not, right? It's not pitch black in this mode, right? You can actually see. So this is what it's useful for. But then if you go ahead and remove it, then it becomes, very, very dark and, going as far as being pitch black sometimes that people just can't see. But anyway, that's sort of the function behind why, there might be times where you might use local brighter mode, and this is just in case, you got people that are just complaining that it's too dark, or maybe they need to adjust their settings and they don't know how. Then maybe you would add or introduce this, but right now in the game, it's supposed to be, right now in the game, it is actually supposed to be, is it 10 o'clock? 10 o'clock at night. We go a little, at this point, we're already like at midnight, right? So, I mean, no matter what time you put it, even if it's midnight, you're still going to be able to see at night. So, I'll go ahead and put myself in here. And since it is enabled, you can see pretty well. I mean, it's not too dark. It's pretty bright. I mean, not that bright, right? But it's kind of bright. But nevertheless, you're able to see much better than would if you did not have it on. So let me go ahead and make sure it is on. Now, when you remove it, though, now things kind of get just a little darker for everybody. And typically, this mode, at least this local bright night mode is for the Game Master, but you can actually adjust it to where you have it globally. So here you go. Now you can see, and even though it's, past midnight, you can still see pretty darn well, actually. So let's go ahead and go back into this and we'll turn it off. And now it's pretty dark, right? I mean, it's big difference as you can see. All right. So moving on, let's go ahead and put it back into daytime, right? And moving to the top, you can also remove the interface. And I think for the most part, this is probably where you might use this in case, you maybe are doing a video, or you're doing some kind of recording, or you're doing something that is, maybe that you want to put in a video, right? Maybe something that you want to put on something that maybe you won't put it on YouTube and so on, or maybe you're making a scenario, maybe you're making a short clip, maybe you're making a short movie, something like that, then this would be a good idea to sort of use this and make it more cinematic, right? Especially if you're recording or you're doing something that's along those lines. Anyway, so that's that guided tour. Basically gives you a guided tour of Game Master and how it works. Of course, we don't need to do this right now. And here you have two different options here. So delete all dead soldiers and destroyed vehicles. So this is just kind of like just recycling. You only have one option on regular Game Master without any mods, but since we do have mods, things are going to look a little bit different as far as what you can and you can't do with Game Master. But overall, you have mainly you just have the recycling where it gets rid of everything that's been destroyed. So if you have multiple things that are destroyed around the map, like vehicles or tanks or dead soldiers around the map, all you got to do is hit this option and it's going to clear them all. So most of everything's going to get reset. There's situations where if something just blew up, it might not actually disappear, but those are specific occasions where maybe you'll have to wait like a minute or two before you can go ahead and do that again. So this is what the top interface does, right? Then you also have your Game Master and you have your Armavision, right? So Armavision on Game Master is where you're able to, kind of do the same thing on the top part, as you can see here, is on the interface. But Armavision just kind of adds that, it's got the grid squares on your screen. It's got the logo on the top, on the bottom right. And so this is the entire interface, as a whole. And one thing about Armavision is that you can use this, especially if you're trying to create a mission and you're trying to put together certain scenarios, and maybe you want to photograph certain areas, and you can also do that from here. So one of the things that you can do is you can change the especially if you want to keep these on your screen. I personally don't, but you can interact with these and you can remove logos. You can add the logo on different parts of the screen if you want. And again, this is something that's more promotional more than anything else. So it's not really something that you would probably be playing around with as much. This is actually something that's a little bit different. In this case, as a Game Master, you can see the name tags on top of people. And if you enable that option, how do you get to this option in the first place, right? Well, you have to go through the edit Armavision properties, and then on the Xbox option, you have to hold the back button. All right, so you hold it, and then this little menu comes up, this toolbox here, and you can move these around. You can add that. You can also redact faces, but in this case, it doesn't really work too well. So you can see because it's redacting something else. But anyway, so things that you probably are not going to use sometimes. Maybe name tags you might, but just to identify people, especially if you're doing a Game Master itself. But other than that, not much. You can also do a grid, which of course, I'm not sure under how this would apply. Maybe if you're kind of doing this, it might kind of look a little bit more of a satellite image, especially if you're creating a scenario. But other than that, probably don't really use them as much. And then you just kind of go here and remove everything, and now you've got a clear view, and you can mix those two, and you're able to kind of move around and explore as well. Or if you're actually in charge of creating a scenario for the regiment, or if you're putting the scenario together, then you can do so this way, right? And just take images or take screenshots and it just put them into a briefing and a presentation, and you're good to go. Anyway, moving on to something else. So we've got that covered. Let me just make sure. Oh yeah, and you can also change sort of the filters as well. So filters is more, you want it to be World War II type, and you can see that there's just black and white scenario. World War One, just more of a vintage scenario, and lens flare. I don't really see much going on here. Yeah, I don't really notice much of a difference. Anyway, so this is how Armavision works, right? We just understand the basics of it, and not really going to be using it as much, but you might use it for certain, cinematic aspects of something you're trying to do or some kind of mission. Anyway, so we go ahead and go back to GM. Now that we're a GM and we understand the different options here from GM to Armavision, and then on the bottom right, you'll see that we have the option menu, right? And these are different structures that are set throughout the map, and I don't really know why these are over here. It's pretty wild. I don't know how these ended up here. But anyway, so you have those options there, and even though I restarted the server, these are supposed to be gone. I'll show you guys how to do all of this soon. Well, yeah, so anyway, so kind of going back, on the right side, that's typically where these things will appear. And then with the left or right bumper, you can actually cycle between characters, groups, vehicles, and right now it's showing empty because there's nothing placed on the map, right? Except for characters, which is myself, or all, right? But you can cycle in between these, and once you start placing objects, then things are gonna start making more sense. But those objects and every objectives, objects, compositions, systems, things like that are going to appear on this little menu, and then you can cycle between all of those as well. At the way bottom, way to the right, you'll see the option of, you'll actually see, not the option, but you'll see the compositions, right? The compositions, the objects, the people as well. You'll see the three characters on the bottom right, which say +2, and then you'll also see the vehicle, and then you'll also see the system items. And so these are things that are going to be placed in a map. There are limits, so if you start placing down, let's say, compositions, then you are going to start running into issues, because then you're not going to be able to place anymore. So an example of this would be, let's say if I start placing down, some of these, but anyway, there's limits, right? Once you get to 100, the point is that once you get to 100, you cannot build any more of those. You cannot place down any AI unless you are in the game. And let's say you've got 100% of vehicles placed down as GM. But then I go and I build, I spawn multiple vehicles, and it'll go over 100. So once you're in the game, you can do that. You can spawn multiple vehicles, but as a GM, you will not be able to spawn any more objects, any more compositions, any more system items as well. So now let's go ahead and go into the factions. The factions will actually appear on the left side. In this case, if I go to add playable factions, they will appear on the left side. So you have the Americans, you have the Russians, the FIA, and then you also have the civilians as well. So if you put these down, you typically need a spawn for each of those. So even if you enable a faction, it does not mean that people will be able to spawn. So in order for individuals to spawn, you need to add a spawn for them for each of the factions. So that's one thing that you need to understand more than anything as a GM, that especially if you're making scenarios for other people, that you need to add spawns for each of those factions, and you can add multiple spawns throughout the map. You don't have to have just one spawn. You can actually have multiple spawns. You can deploy multiple spawns around the map, but since we're just covering the basics, we're just going to sort of go with that. Moving on, this is where you can see those factions. You can open faction menu, spawn point, objective, seize objective, move to objective, and then on the Xbox, you can certainly do this, and it's pretty cool, but it's not as good as if you were on PC. But anyway, so you have, once since we're not really covering this right now, we are just going to go ahead and move on to just, understanding what happens, that now that you have a faction in place, right? And, you've added a spawn, and that's cool, right? You've gotten those two things right. Then, once you select one of these factions, you can open the faction menu holding the Y button for Xbox, and you basically drop the spawn point at this point. So we're not looking to put a spawn up, right? But you click on the left D-pad, and you should be able to sort of add objectives for those. In this case, you're not able to sort of edit the entities. You can also add playable entities, so you can add other factions, but you will not be able to play on those unless you enable them, right? So if you do not add a spawn point, if you don't set this as playable and then you add a spawn point, it's not going to matter. So you need a spawn point, and you got to make the the faction playable. Otherwise, you're still not going to be able to spawn. So now you basically get to put down custom objectives if you want. And there's multiple objectives that you can go, board vehicles. And of course, this is all just kind of come down into what kind of scenario you put forth, but we're not really going to, cover that much. But that's what the menu does, right? This is what, this is one of those things that after you select it, you can customize the objective however you want. Typically, it's not something that we kind of do right off the bat. You definitely want to create your scenario first, and then you want to go ahead and set your objectives. But we'll come back to that. Anyway, so that's what the factions do on your left side. You can also snap to surface, and you'll see those options there as well. Move vertically, rotate as well, and you can snap with the RB with the right bumper, at least on the on the Xbox or on the legacy controls. So that's sort of the one thing we understand now. Then we move into what is the actual scenario properties. So some people might just kind of, go into the, I don't think it's available here. So you can't really do that from here. So as always, you want to edit the scenario properties. And in my case, as a GM, you can hit the back button. I'm not sure what it is on PC, but you have your menu. And so as I'm looking at this, there's about at the bottom, you'll see that there's 107 pages of this, right? And we can go all the way to 100, but we're not really going to do that, right? But you see that there's lots of options. And then as you're going through it as well, as you're going through these options, you'll also notice that at the bottom right, there is, sort of like a before adding these units, you'll see how much they're going to take up as far as like, character limits, the character threshold. And so I haven't added them, but as you can see, the changes, right? Some of these have 1, 2, 3. Why some of them are different, I'm not sure, right? But anyway, so we'll just kind of put these guys down. And then once you place them down, then besides, because I'm here, I count as 1, and then these guys are 4, 5, 6. Okay, yeah, so as you notice that, that the individuals are kind of picked up. So now you've got about 4%, right? If I was to raise myself, that would go down to 3%. But anyway, so typically on regular Game Master, you don't have all of these options here, like equip weapon or edit prop. I mean, you do have edit properties, copy selected or paste or any of those other stuff here, enable weapon controls and so on. You don't really have these options. So that's one thing. And then yeah, so this is what it all means, right? And here you can actually kind of cycle back and forth with the left and right bumper in between vehicles and so on. Now you can use these as fast options, but I don't typically use these options as much. But let's go ahead and go into the filters, right? So one thing that I do use quite often, I would encourage you to use as well, is the filters option here, because as soon as you enable a filter, you actually get to see everything that's within that faction. So if you go here, you select the filter for US, everything that's, basically 20 pages, 20 sections worth of US vehicles, structures, and things like that are going to appear, right? So, mines, air, compositions, objects, system items, groups, and so on and so forth. So a lot of that is going to appear on your screen. And then you also have, just like you can also do with the Russians, right? The FIA, the civilians as well. So everything that's civilians, everything that's basically civilian, you'll be able to use. And as far as vehicles, right? And also put down civilians in case, whatever kind of mission you're wanting to put together involves civilians. And FIA as well, as you can see. A lot of it here is definitely part of the FIA stuff. So besides that, I typically go into these filters, and then once I'm in the filters, if you want to reset it, if you look at the bottom right part, you'll have the reset button. So you click that button and it should kind of, if you have, let's say, 3 different factions selected, and you have basically wanting to kind of go back to 0 where you can see everything, you just hit the reset and it'll just turn it all back to the main filter. So anyway, so you can see that you have access to the filters here. Now you can select multiple filters at a time. Let's say you're not really interested in using any of the, individual characters or the individual vehicles or system composition items or anything like that. You want to go straight to groups, so you can select the faction that you're wanting to use, that you're wanting to select, and then you go to group. And then that is only going to allow you to place down groups of squads or groups of troops, and then these are going to be the ones that you're going to be able to put down on the map, right? So then the next thing that we want to do is we can go to, let's say if you want to go into doing individual soldiers, right? So you just want to put down individual troops. Here we have crewman, crew commander, and pilots as well. We've got pilots, and typically these are kind of done individually, so you could place them down in case, that's something that's going to be part of your mission, shooters and so on. And I typically tend to lean more towards individual than doing groups, because groups is just kind of, I feel like it's kind of a lazy way of putting a scenario together, and you put a group up and it's just, you know, I think I would mainly use groups in case like the mission is kind of you're kind of running out of stuff on the mission, and you're running out of troops, or your AI has been killed off, or maybe you're doing like a counterattack, then I would use groups. But other than that, if you're trying to really create a good mission, a mission that's kind of specifically down to the individual, and people putting troops around individually in different locations or in checkpoints and stuff like that, individuals are probably the best way to go, especially if you're trying to put that together. Likewise, you can do so with vehicles. You can do so with system items. Now, system items are obviously going to include your spawn points. They're going to include your, the mines, the arsenals, and so on, right? You have these composition items. Sorry, these system items. And then the composition items are going to be more of things that you build, like your command post. And of course, that costs about 4 composition. So if you have people that are in your Game Master and, they come in here and they start building stuff, because maybe you've allowed them to, or that's part of the mission, then you're also going to see their composition start to take up, right? So, here you'll see that, I place down this composition, I put down this composition. So if somebody comes in here and starts putting down more relays and stuff, then that's going to drive up the cost of the competitions, just like it's doing it here as well, right? So it's going to go to 6, and then some of these obviously cost more. Like this one by itself costs 6. I think that's quite substantial. You can also kind of move them up and down a bit. Obviously, you probably don't want to do this and just kind of leave it up in the air, but you can also put those up there as well, the helipads and so on and so forth. So a lot of it, especially if you're trying to just, let's say, just do Russian compositions, then you can specifically just filter out everything that has to do with Russian. So that way you're not having to kind of scroll and find it through here, and it takes a while. Objects are more stuff that's, more of the in-game objects, you're pretty sure familiar with, like the beehives. These are probably just to, mock up the mission a little bit. And then these actually just cost on objects. They have an object cost. Now, the thing about these is that it's good to place, definitely good scenery and missions, and, have stuff around that makes it just the experience, makes it a little more immersive. But it's also a good idea not to place down too much, because then your game will actually your frames can actually start dropping as well. So, it just depends on what you're really trying to do. You can put down bridges, small bridges, long bridges, fence barriers, and so on. Equipment boxes. Now they're just for show, they're just props pretty much. You don't really get to interact with them at all. So if I go up to them, nothing happens to them. Nothing happens to them either. You have all of these, and you can't access them. You can just put them down. And some of these you can actually kind of mix in between both. So you could put down like one of these tents, and then you can put down like, let's say, a bunker as well. Let's say you just want to do US stuff, right? So it's going to show you everything that's US objects, just like Russians have. And then you can just kind of make a little pillbox here as well, right? Make it a kind of concealed, interact with it a little bit. Now you've got something that's semi, immersive, or, especially if we're talking about objectives. You got radios as well. You can put down some of these, you can actually put down on top of other structures and so on. So you have these as well, and these are just cool structures that you can put down. You just have to really get down to like this level of detail, so that in case you're trying to set up a base somewhere and you're trying to kind of customize it and do, just put things around, then that also kind of works to make the mission just much more interactive and much more immersive, detail oriented in that sense. And then you have Game Master effects. Now, Game Master effects, for the most part, they're pretty standard. You can put down smoke, you can put down, artillery barrages. These usually have to be modified here, and they won't actually activate until you activate them through this, right? So you have this rounds per minute, how many rounds you want to fall, and the radius. Right, so I just want like 10 rounds, and then it takes a couple of seconds, but you should be able to look at. So anyway, so you have that. Then a lot of these are not available on your typical Game Master. But anyway, so these are just additional filtered options, armed vehicles, everything that has to do with arms. So I would suggest just kind of starting out with using your faction, and then just kind of narrowing down what you want to do, and yeah, just playing around with this and putting it all down, customizing your mission to how you want it, and then just setting down props and the dynamic of how the mission's actually going to work out. So that is typically how this works. So that's your inventory, right? Your entity browser. I'm sorry. This is your entity browser, and so you have a more or less knowledge of how this would actually work. And now we are moving to the actual scenario. Here in this case, just kind of coming back to this, if you want to put down, let's say you've got somebody that just jumped in the game, you can go down to, you can go down to composition, system items, go ahead and put a spawn point up. So you'll see that even if once you jump out of Game Master, now you should see, especially if you have faction enabled, then you can go straight into this. Right, and you can actually spawn. Of course, now we have somebody in here. Anyway, so you can do that through this, or you can also go through the faction menu, and you can set the spawn point. You can choose the objective, seize objective, defend objective, or a custom objective. In this case, let's say we want to do just a move, and then edit properties. And if we just want to do regular move, exfiltrate, investigate, and then these are going to appear autocomplete task, and then so that's going to be an objective for when that person gets nearby, and it's going to show up on the map as well. It's going to say investigate. So you have these markers, and these are typically just going to be part of that process. So you have, anyway, so this is the objective, and as soon as you head into it, somebody comes near it, as part of the mission, then objective will autocomplete as soon as they get close to it. And so yeah, that's one of the things you can do. The other thing that is also part of, good to know or need to know as far as how this works in terms of like the weather and all of that, you have to go through this option here, which you hold the back button in this case scenario, because if you just tap it, it gives you access to the entity browser. But if you're trying to get a hold, to make sure that you're able to customize the weather, that you're able to customize everything else, you hold the back button, you go into see which enable the playable factions. There's multiple ways to kind of get to the same place. Some of it is just kind of easier than others, right? But you can also set playable factions from this. Global supply usage, if you put no, then that means that if you go to a barracks or living quarters, or if you go to a command post, or if you spawn vehicles, there's an unlimited amount of supply. So there's no supply limit, right? If you put yes on it, then everything's going to cost, right? So vehicles are going to cost, AI is going to cost, so on. Enable, disable respawns, pretty self-explanatory. Enable deployable radios, and this is if you have friendlies, and you can base it off of supplies, you can base it off of a fixed amount. As long as somebody's carrying a radio, then they should be able to spawn on it. This is just for you to be able to sort of look at the kill feed and figure out whether somebody, who killed who, pretty much. Global arsenal mode, this just means that, unrestricted just means that all items are available, while setting to conflict means only items available in the conflict game mode are available. So in this case, we probably want to do unrestricted, and that way people get access to everything within that particular faction. But anyway, so you have all of these different options here, and this is where you get to determine all of this, punish team killing, showing mortar shell ballistic data, perceived faction changes that affect AI, Game Master budget. And of course, this thing is you set it to disabled to be able to spawn over 9,000 vehicles. If you disable it, then people can just spawn as much crap as they want. And you probably don't want to do that because that might crash the game. From here, you can actually set the time of day, what time you want it to be, the day specifically, you have full moons, half moons, the month as well. Some of these might actually influence the way that the game behaves, and time progression as well. Time progression is kind of tricky, especially if you want the time to go really fast and you just want to set it as high as you want. That way you can have, day and night times kind of rotate a lot quicker. Again, global brighter night mode if you want people to see at night as well. Another part of it's another part of the game, right? As I mentioned. So going back to this, you also have the weather. You can set to either automate the weather, or you can choose the type of weather condition that you want. So you can do clouds, set it to where there's clouds. You can set it to where there is rain. Well, you can set it to where, it's, what is this? Overcast, multiple different types, thunder, lightning, rain. And this is how you would normally be able to modify the weather. You can also modify the wind and increase the wind speed as well. It just kind of depends on what you're really trying to do with this mission that you're trying to create and put forth. So anyway, coming back to this general entity, the consumption rate of fuel, leading rate, global skill level, how hard you want the AI to be. Typically, some of these features are kind of set into mods. So this one's actually a mod. This is actually also part of mod as well. And we don't really need to go over these because you're not really going to be messing around with much of these. Anyway, so that kind of covers the basics of what you need to know. Just tips or advice. When you're putting down structures, make sure that you've got yourself in the right limit. Make sure that you're also making the engagement overstimulating the you're not overstimulating the game with a lot of stuff going on, or you're adding constant bombardments or explosions and just kind of overloading the game with a lot of stuff. You probably don't want to do that. So, what else? And yeah, so I think that kind of, just basically explains, besides being able to cast lightning, from your menu here, cast lightning, is objects or entities inside one of these, because you'll have these, and these are just slots where you can put down structures, and it'll just kind of give you those suggestions. But other than that, things are pretty self-explanatory at this point. What else? So we covered just about quite a bit. So appreciate your time, and we'll cover more on our next training.